intentionally or unintentionally, people were being led to believe that indulgences in paying for their sins in some monetary way or through works was how they were going to gain salvation. And that completely maligned the cross of Christ. And Martin Luther raised awareness about that. And for that, I am extremely thankful.
There is, I will grant, he did change over time, but he did change over time. So earlier on, he was a little bit better, more of a reformer than later on. All of the anti-Semitic comments came later in his life. They didn't come earlier in his life. However, let's not forget that he did add that first sola, that only faith from Romans. He added that. And in subsequent translations...
But that is not the only place where the Bible talks about by faith alone. And in fact, if you just want to look at the gospel in general, the fact that Jesus had to die and was buried and was raised again, that would not have had to happen if it was faith and something else.
Of course
not.
He
could have just said, hey, Allie, be a little bit holier, act a little bit better. If that was the case, he would have been totally fine with the Pharisees because the Pharisees were the holiest of them all. But obviously it wasn't about works. It was about faith.
Of course, but I think it's a straw man. I don't see anywhere in church teaching where the Catholic Church has ever taught that through works you will earn your salvation. The Church explicitly called that a heresy. That's the heresy of Pelagius in the 4th or 5th century. And we do know, I am certain, of course, Christ's sacrifice was perfect, but let's not forget that Christ says to Peter, Peter, you're a rock. On this rock I'll build my church. Here are the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. He also said there will be many who come to me and say, Lord, Lord, who will not see the kingdom of heaven. And of course, James says, faith without works is dead.
Absolutely, and that's actually exactly what Martin Luther came to preach about, that there will be many who say, Lord, Lord, who actually will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Because what Martin Luther did is he said, this is not about your external proof of whether you are saved or not. This is about your heart. And I'm not saying the entirety of the Catholic faith preaches otherwise, but he felt where he was that was the trend that was going on. At least the people in the Catholic Church were starting to focus too much on the outer works and not enough on true repentance in their heart. And that's exactly what Martin Luther came to refocus the church on, was focusing on the heart transformation that grace through faith actually accomplishes. Because you're right, faith without works is dead, but works without faith is nothing.
Sure, but when has the Catholic Church ever taught otherwise? When has the Catholic Church ever taught that you'll earn your way to heaven through works? I don't deny that there were corrupt professional pardoners. Obviously, many popes condemned them explicitly. But if Martin Luther's problem was with some local bishops and some local priests selling heaven or trying to sell heaven to ignorant people, then that's a political conversation. That's not a theological refutation.
Allie just said that. The issue is instead of saying, oh, okay, Martin Luther, we'll look this over, we'll talk about this. He was persecuted for coming to his archbishop and saying these things. He was brought and told to say mea culpa before him. And instead of doing that, he stood his ground. And of course, like as you said, years later, he seemed to become a little bit embittered. But let's not forget.
That's an understatement, sure.
Yeah, well, as I'm saying, it was because Catholic mobs attacked his followers and burned them at the stake and stoned them.
Well, so if anybody was a proponent of burning at the stake, I think we would all agree that Martin Luther was a proponent of it.
Well, sure, and I'm not going to defend Martin Luther in his entirety. After all, if there was one thing Catholics and Protestants were united in, it was the persecution of the early evangelicals. Of course, they weren't called that back then, but that exactly what Allie has said. It's more about by faith alone and standing up to the corruption of his day.
I will bring up this point though, because I am sympathetic to a lot of these Protestant arguments, and I do like a lot of Protestant theologians and apologists. But there is this one sticking point, because the question here, especially with Luther, is the church the church? Is the Pope in the Petrine line, in the line of Peter? And did Christ institute a real church on earth with a real clergy and real buildings and real windows in real places? Or is it strictly an ethereal sort of thing that floats about and does not have real clergy and real windows and things like that? And it just seems to me that in a religion which is based on a fact, it's not based on a philosophy, it's based on a fact, the incarnation of the divine Logos into a particular person, through a particular mother, at a particular place, in a particular time, where he performed particular miracles in space and time on real people, and then literally was killed by someone named Pontius Pilate, and then was literally resurrected, stayed around for 6 weeks, and then ascended into heaven, that it makes sense to me that that guy would have picked 12 real people to be the apostles, and when he said, I establish a church, would have established a real institution on earth. It's hard for me to get beyond that, and to think that really there's all fact, a unity of the symbol and the symbolized, of the Logos and the Creator and the creation. But then it just becomes ethereal after that.